midst of the Spanish flu pandemic, when the world was caught in the grip of uncertainty and loss, the nurses who fought on the front lines bore witness to some of the most heart-wrenching moments of human endurance. This is the story of one of those nurses, her journey through the relentless tide of illness and death. Leave a like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. The fever season, November 1918, Philadelphia, United States. The air is still heavy with the sharp scent of carbolic acid and something more sinister, an invisible weight that presses down on every chest in the ward. Outside, the leaves have turned brittle and brown, littering the cobblestone streets, but the usual signs of autumn, children laughing, shopkeepers calling out, are nowhere to be found. Philadelphia is silent, grieving, quarantined. The world feels like it's folding in on itself. The war in Europe may be drawing to a close, but here, in the heart of a proud American city, we are fighting a different war, a quieter one. The enemy is microscopic, nameless, and cruel. It doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't fly a flag. It seeps through the air, clings to door handles and prayer books, hides in the warmth of a cough, and lodges itself in the lungs like a poisoner. Fog. They call it influenza, but that word feels too delicate, too clinical. In the ward, we call it what it is, the Blue Death. I've been working these floors for 17 days straight, maybe more. I've stopped counting. The sun rises and falls like the sweep of a metronome. But inside the hospital, time dissolves. You start measuring your hours not by clocks, but by heartbeats, fevers, and the slow stillness of the dying. Each bed is its own battlefield. Each patient, a soldier trying to survive the onslaught within their own body. My name is Margaret Leland. I'm 24 years old, and I have not slept a full night in over 2 weeks. I trained as a nurse just a year ago, believing I might serve overseas, tending to wounded boys in the trenches of France. But instead I've been stationed here, at the emergency ward, set up inside the basement of the old grammar school on Pine Street. We've turned classrooms into triage stations. The chalkboards still bear ghostly scrolls of long-forgotten lessons, obscured now by the shadows of cots and the flickering light of kerosene lamps. This morning, I begin my shift like every other, by stepping into the low, grey light and breathing through a mask that smells of vinegar and damp linen. My hands, cracked and raw, tremble as I fasten the cotton ties behind my head. I've lost weight, my cheeks are hollow, my fingernails are permanently stained with tincture and iodine. I pass the rows of beds. Some patients stir, hacking into soiled cloths, their faces blotched with the dark cyanosis that signals the end. Others lie still, covered in damp sheets, their breathing shallow. The silence is thick, no groaning, no weeping, just the rattle of breath and the occasional moan of iron bed frames shifting under restless bodies. We are out of morphine, out of fresh linens, nearly out of quinine. The city has run dry of coffins, so now they bury the dead wrapped in sheets or bundled together unceremoniously into pine boxes stacked too deep. The undertakers have stopped coming. The hearses do not arrive. Instead, we cover the dead with tarpaulins and carry them 4 at a time to the alley where they wait for collection. There is no dignity in death here, only necessity. A boy in bed 17 is dying. I know it before I touch his forehead. His name is Samuel, 10 years old. He arrived 3 days ago with his mother, who died that same night. We don't tell the children when their parents pass. There's no point. It won't help them survive. lean down and press a damp cloth to Samuel's forehead. His eyes flutter open, glassy and unseeing. His lips are dark, tinged almost purple. Cyanosis. His lungs are filling, drowning him from the inside out. I want to cry, but I have no tears left. I murmur his name and he tries to speak, but only a rattle comes. I hold his hand. It's ice cold. He's gone before the hour ends. We cover his face with the sheet. I move to the next bed, and then the next. Each patient a story cut short. Clerks, seamstresses, veterans, children. The Spanish flu has no preferences, no prejudices. It kills the strong just as swiftly as the weak. Doctors die alongside paupers. Priests, barmaids, bakers. I watched a fellow nurse collapse last Thursday. Mary. She'd only just turned 19. I have grown used to the smell of death, though some days it still catches me off guard. Sweet, sickly, metallic. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes and your skin long after you've gone home. Though home is a relative term now. I sleep on a cot in the boiler room beneath the school. My apartment is untouched, quarantined. I have not seen my family in a month. Outside, the city continues its slow descent. The trolleys run empty. Schools are closed. Theatres boarded. Church bells toll not for services, but for the dead. There are whispers that the flu came with the soldiers, brought over from France like a curse. Others say it started in Kansas, in a military camp where the men dropped like flies. The doctors don't know what to believe. Some still bleed the sick with leeches. Others burn sulphur in the corners of the room and swear it keeps the illness at bay. We do what we can. Vinegar, soaks, mustard plasters, oxygen tanks that rattle and sputter. I once held a child's face in my hands and breathed for him, willing him to stay alive. He died an hour later. The worst part, I think, is the eyes. Everyone's eyes. Hollow, exhausted. The living look no different from the dead. And us nurses. We've stopped speaking to each other unless absolutely necessary. There's nothing left to say. We just keep moving, like ghosts ourselves. You focus on the work. You wipe the brows, empty the pans, change the bandages, clean the vomit, mop the blood and phlegm from the floors. You do it again and again until the hours blur. I hear a commotion near the doors. A man is being brought in. A sailor, judging by the cut of his coat. He's moaning, wild-eyed, half-conscious. Blood specks his lips, and his breath comes in shallow gasps. We take him to the back, where the cots are still warm from the last patient. I roll up my sleeves, tie on a fresh apron, and begin again. Bzah! The end of the night. 7 more have died. I sit down just once near the water pump and press my head to my knees. My apron is soaked through. My hands sting from the bleach. Outside, the cold is settling in, but the fever never leaves this place. I think about Mary, about Samuel, about all the names I've stopped trying to remember. And then I stand, because there's another bed to tend, another life to try and save. The night isn't over yet. I don't know when it will be, but until it is, until the coughing stops and the eyes close, and this plague finally lifts, I will keep going, one trembling hand at a time, because I am a nurse and this is the front line. The name he whispers, October 1918, US Army Camp Hospital, number 16, outside Paris. A soldier clutches a photograph of his wife as the nurse holds his hand through his final breath. He whispers her name and nothing else. His fingers are trembling, slick with fever sweat, but he refuses to let go of the tiny portrait, a black and white photo, creased down the middle, edges curled from being folded into the lining of his uniform for months. The image is faint now, blurred by time and moisture, but you can still see her smile. Soft, gentle, the kind of smile that belongs to a world untouched by war or sickness, a world long gone. His name is Private Thomas Avery, Illinois, 23 years old. He was brought in 2 days ago, collapsing on the transport train from the front. He didn't make it through triage. By the time I reached him, he was already mottled with cyanosis. His lungs had turned to liquid. Each breath he takes now sounds like water bubbling up through cracked glass, rattling, straining. He wheezes with every gasp, but still, he clings to that photograph like it's the only thing tethering him to this earth, and maybe it is. The wind outside howls against the canvas siding of the hospital tent. The walls flap like lungs struggling for air. Rain taps against the roof in a rhythm that feels almost like a pulse. It's been storming for days. The ground is soaked. The paths between wards turn to thick, sucking mud. The skies are grey, heavy, oppressive, matching the weight inside every heart still beating in this place. There are 60 beds in this section of the field hospital. Only 10 nurses, 4 doctors. We lose at least 15 men a day, sometimes more. The Spanish influenza doesn't care if you've been shot at in the trenches or if you just arrived at the station. It picks men off like dandelions in a breeze. Quiet, efficient, cruel. I sit beside Private Avery's bed, gloved fingers laced around his. My mask is damp against my mouth from hours of use, but I barely notice it anymore. His lips move, dry, cracked. I lean in to hear him. He whispers her name. Elsie. It's barely audible. A breath, a memory escaping. His eyes are wide, staring, not at me, but through me, past me, at something else entirely. Maybe he sees her. Maybe in his mind she's standing at the edge of the bed, holding out her arms, smiling like she did in that photograph. He coughs again, and his body jolts. I tighten my grip on his hand. He squeezes weakly. The photo slips a little, curling against his chest, and I gently adjust it so it rests above his heart. His uniform is gone, replaced with a cotton gown stained with iodine and blood, but the dog tags still hang from his neck. They rattle with each shallow breath. Elsie, he says again, voice fainter this time. His eyes blink slowly, then flutter closed. His lips stop moving. I hold his hand long after the breath leaves him. No priest arrives. There's no time, no last rites. Only me, a nurse, another faceless figure behind a white mask, who will remember the name of a woman I'll never meet, who will fold the photograph gently into his hands before the orderlies come with the stretcher. There is no dignity in how they go. We can only offer presence, a quiet voice, a hand to hold, and the kindness of not letting them die alone. Outside, the rain continues. The wounded keep coming. A bell rings 3 times, signalling another admission. I do not move yet. I sit with him a moment longer, because in this place, grief is rationed like everything else. You get only what you can afford to carry. And I can spare 30 more seconds. I place the blanket over his face and whisper her name, one last time, because he can't anymore. Elsie. Then I rise, clean my hands with carbolic, and step into the aisle between the beds, where another soldier is coughing blood into his hands and calling out for a mother who won't come. There are no breaks, no time to mourn, each one, I remember the details, a photo, a name, the curve of a smile, half faded, because if I don't, no one else will, and if that's all I can give them in the end, a witness, then I'll give it over and over until my own lungs fail, because this is not just illness, this is war, a war fought in bedsheets and silence, and I am a soldier too, a nurse in the last season of the dying. The stillness after. November 1918, US Army Base Hospital No. 12, France. The nurse watches white sheets being pulled over still bodies, one after the other, in silence that has become routine. The cloth barely makes a sound, just a soft hiss of fabric as it's drawn over their faces. Taut linen slipping across cold, stiffened features, like snowfall blanketing the contours of a forgotten landscape. There are 4 of them this morning, 4 before the sun has even crested the eastern horizon. 4 men whose lungs drowned, them from the inside out, whose final gasps rattled through a room already thick with the stench of sickness, sweat and carbolic acid. I stand near the end of Ward C, gloved hands clenched around a metal basin filled with bloodied gauze and mucus-soaked rags. My apron is stiff in places, darkened by stains that never fully wash out, rust red, bile yellow, and streaks of grey from where flesh has decayed. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. My stomach turned at the smell of boiled cabbage and gristle in the mess tent, and I couldn't bring myself to go back. The orderly folds the sheets with the kind of grim precision one only gains from endless repetition. He doesn't look at their faces anymore. Neither do most of us, not unless they say something before the end. A name, a memory, a word worth holding. Otherwise, they're just numbers now. 2874, 2875, 2876. Their boots are already tagged. Their personal effects, if they had any, will be placed into brown paper parcels, sealed and marked with a name and a date. Sometimes we scribble a note, spoke of daughter, or asked for rain. Little things, meaningless to the army, but maybe not to whoever waits for news back home. The worst are the ones who come in and die before we learn their names. Just pale boys with skin already turning blue, unconscious from fever, skulls drenched in sweat, and spines arching in agony with each convulsion. We number those too, but in my head I give them other names. Thomas, Edward, William, names that belong to people who might have lived, names to stop them from being just another corpse rolled down to the shed by the latrines, where the bodies are stacked like firewood in the November chill. I remember when the silence still made me flinch. Now it wraps around everything, a quiet so total, it feels like pressure in your ears. Even the groans of the dying blend into the hush, like a distant wind rattling through canvas and bone. I glance down the row of beds, eyes moving over faces bathed in the watery grey light of morning. Some still live. Their chests rise in shallow bursts, a stuttering motion that looks too weak to go on. They clutch at blankets, fever blind, murmuring in languages I don't always understand. French, Gaelic, Polish. One boy cried out in German. Last week, his body riddled with purple blotches, his mouth foaming. No one knew what to say. We just held him until the end. It takes only minutes for the body to go still. Just one more breath, then none. The change is immediate limbs stiffen, the head lolls, the eyes glass over and fix on something. That isn't here. Some stare upward, some to the side. I always try to close them, not because I believe in souls, not anymore, but because no one should be left like that, wide-eyed and watching nothing. Today, the silence is broken by a gurgling cough from the far end. I move quickly, footsteps echoing against the wooden slats beneath the beds. The man is drowning. Again, the fluid in his lungs rises faster than we can drain it. I bend over him, pressing the rubber suction tube into the corner of his mouth, careful not to hurt him. His lips are blue-black. His breath smells like rot, like something alive is died inside of him. He claws at my wrist, eyes wild, and I press his hand gently down. Shh, I whisper. You're all right. I'm here. He isn't, and I'm not. His eyes flutter. The suction pulls up mucus tinted pink with blood. I spit a curse into my mask. I know this look. I've seen it 100 times in the last 2 weeks, maybe more. The dread comes, not as a scream, but as a dull, icy weight in my chest. A certainty. This, one will not see the night. I wipe his mouth and stroke his forehead with a cloth soaked in diluted alcohol. It's the best I can do. He shivers beneath the covers, and I pull the blanket tighter. He reminds me of my brother. Not in the face, but in how he trembles, how small he seems now, curled on that cot like a child. Another man begins coughing 2 beds over. I turn, nod to the orderly, and he takes my place. I move to the next. Every breath is a race now, every minute a fight, but most of them lose. The lungs fill, the fever climbs, the brain burns out, and the heart gives in. That's the rhythm of this place. Even the rats know it. I've seen them scurry under the floorboards during the quiet hours, drawn by the scent of vomit and death. They keep to the corners, but they're growing bolder. One of the nurses tried to kill one with a boot last night. Missed. Laughed like a mad woman after. Then cried herself to sleep in the supply room. We all cry in private now. If there's any humanity left in us, it lives behind closed doors, in the brief moments when we let the mask slip. Literally and otherwise. Outside, I hear the low rumble of wagons arriving. More bodies, more stretchers, more men staring at the sky and wondering if they'll make it through the night. I press a hand to my chest, just above the neckline of my apron, where a tiny crucifix used to hang. I lost it somewhere in Ward B weeks ago. I still reach for it, out of habit. There is no God here, only pain and silence and the ever-present scent of decay. I return to the bed where the orderly has just finished covering another face. Sheet is pulled up with reverence, but not ceremony. The body is still. The chest no longer rises. The hand that clutched at the air moments ago lies slack, curled into a final fist. The orderly glances at me. I nod. He tags the toe, scribbles the time of death, and begins pushing the stretcher toward the morgue tent. I stand in place, watching the empty bed for a while longer, listening to the silence and wondering if anyone back home will light a candle for this one, wondering how many more before dusk. Then I walk to the next bed and I begin again. Letters from Another World, December 1918, US Army Base, Hospital, number 12, France. The letter is thin, just a single sheet, soft from wear, the corners curled like the edges of dried petals. The envelope bears the familiar script of her father's hand. Neat, angular, the ink slightly smudged from the long journey overseas. The post came in with the supply wagon just after dawn. A sack of correspondence dumped onto the staff table near the mess. The nurses rarely expect good news anymore, but we still gather, still reach, with fingers that tremble ever so slightly as we thumb through names and return addresses, eyes scanning for handwriting we'd recognise in our sleep. I find mine near the bottom of the pile. My heart hitches, just once, like a skipped beat, then steadies. I don't open it immediately. I press it between my fingers, run my thumb over the seal, as if feeling for bad news through the paper. There's a heaviness to it, despite its weightlessness, a gravity that tugs at the pit of my stomach. I wait until the ward is calm enough to spare the seconds. Mid-morning. The light outside is a pallid, chalky grey. Snow flurries tap against the tent's canvas in soft, erratic rhythms. Inside, the moans have subsided for now. Most of the patients are unconscious or sedated. One is dying. The man in the third bed, whose breathing sounds like a saw dragged through wet wood. I step into the small alcove near the linen closet, where a single oil lamp burns beside a basin filled with cloudy disinfectant. I pull off one glove with my teeth, careful not to touch my face and break the seal. The note is short. My father doesn't waste words. Joseph is ill. Cough and fever came on fast. Doctor says it's the influenza. Your mother is beside herself. We are doing all we can. He asks for you often. Write when you can. Father, that's all. No embellishment, no false hope. Just the truth, dry and plain. My hands tremble slightly as I fold the letter back into thirds and slide it into the pocket of my apron, between the bandage shears and the scrap of cloth I use to wipe my eyes when no one's looking. I don't cry. I can't. There's no space for mourning something that hasn't happened yet, and certainly no time to fall apart over a boy 3,000 miles away when men here are dying inches from my hands. Instead, I reach for the bottle of carbolic acid and refill the wash basin. The scent is sharp and medicinal, masking the sour undertone of sickness that saturates every thread of canvas and wool. I pull my glove back on, tighten the strings of my mask, and re-enter the ward. The soldier in the third bed is seizing now. His arms twitch violently against the mattress, his head snapping side to side. I hurry to his side, steadying him, wedging cloth between his teeth to stop him biting through his tongue. His skin is a strange mottled grey, the death hue we've started calling it, a signal flare from the body's depths, warning that the organs are shutting down. His lips are cracked and bleeding, his eyes rolling back. I whisper to him, even though he can't hear me, "Easy now. I've got you." I hold his shoulders down until the convulsions pass. Then I wipe his brow, which is hot enough to burn through. The glove. The fever is always worst in the end. Behind me, another nurse retches into a waste bin. She's young, too young for this. Only 3 weeks in country, and already her hands are calloused and shaking. I hear her whispering to herself. A prayer, maybe. Or a name. Or both. I look at the soldier's chest. It rises, falls, then pauses, then rises again, shallower. The nurse crosses herself. I do not. Instead, I glance towards the open flap of the ward where the wind is starting to blow harder, rattling the tent poles and sending white flurries swirling into the air like ash. Somewhere back home, my brother might be watching the same. Snowfall. He's only 11. Freckles, red ears in winter, a laugh that used to echo down the hallway until it made the floorboards creak. I picture him in bed, sweating, coughing, his small lungs filling the same way I've seen happen here over and over over again. The same slow drowning. I feel bile rise in my throat. I push it down. There's no room for softness here. Not anymore. My love for him will not save him. My tears will not heal him. And my absence from this ward will not keep these men alive. So, I fold that pain into a little box inside my chest and seal it tight, and I go to the next bed. The man there is half conscious. His mask has slipped, and pink-tinged sputum crusts the corners of his lips. His breathing is shallow. I wet a cloth with water gone tepid in the chill and dab it against his mouth. His eyes open briefly, just a flicker. He whispers something I can't understand, then closes them again. I watch his pulse in his neck, faint but steady, for now. The matron calls out for fresh linens. I answer, stepping away from the bedside, hands already moving. My apron brushes against my knees, the letter still tucked away in the pocket. A hidden weight. I change the sheets of the dead without flinching. I bandage split lips. I clean vomit from the floor. I whisper comfort to strangers who cannot hear me, and write names on toe tags with a hand that no longer shakes. Because this is the job. This is what I chose. To stand between the living and the dead for as long as my own lungs will let me. And so I work. And I pray. Not to God, but to whatever thread of fate is still left in this broken world. That my brother's fever breaks. That the doctor back home is not overwhelmed. That someone wipes his brow and whispers to him gently. That someone, somewhere, does for him what I do here for others. Until then, I keep going. Because grief, like the flu, spreads fastest when you stop moving. One step behind, January 1919. Temporary influenza ward, 42nd Division, Field Hospital, France. The priest walks slow. His cassock is faded black, nearly grey now, rubbed thin at the elbows and hem. The fabric catches the winter light through the tent flap as he moves, a flickering silhouette against the pale morning sun that never seems to warm the ground. He walks like someone carrying something much heavier than a Bible. Perhaps it's the weight of so many names already forgotten, or the growing list of those he cannot save. Each step he takes, I take one, after. He carries a small silver crucifix, worn smooth by the oils of too many fingers and the prayers of too many dying men. I carry a tin pail of tepid water, a cloth stained with old iodine, and a syringe of morphine tucked into the folds of my apron. We are a procession of two, holy man and nurse, chasing a death that always seems to be a step ahead. The men lie in two long rows, heads toward the centre, feet to the walls. 70 cots, many double stacked when space ran out. Their bodies twitch beneath wool blankets, most too fevered to speak, others too far gone to bother. The air is thick with the scent of vinegar and sweat, of rot and bleach and something worse. The sickly sweet stench of lungs filling with fluid. We start with Private Mason. He has been here 5 days, 31 years old. New York dock worker, before the war, had a crooked tooth he was proud of. Said it gave him character. Now his gums are pale. His lips crack like porcelain. He hasn't opened his eyes in 2 days. The priest kneels. He mutters the rites softly in Latin. The same rhythm over and over. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. He anoints Mason's forehead with oil, hands shaking slightly, not from age, from exhaustion. I kneel behind him. I wet a cloth and dab the soldier's brow. the least bruising. The morphine goes in slow. He doesn't react. But I like to think some small part of him feels the easing of pain. We move on. Private Leblanc, Corporal Hughes, Lieutenant Orr, a boy from Kansas whose name I can't remember, but who sings hymns under his breath when the fever spikes. Each man is a ritual. Oil, cross, water, morphine. I do not speak, and the priest barely does. Words have become too precious to waste on what we can no longer change. At the seventh bed, the priest pauses. A young man lies curled tightly, knees to chest like a child in the womb. Blood is crusted around his nostrils and lips. He stares straight ahead, not blinking. His eyes are wide and glassy, the whites tinged yellow. His chart says his name is Elias, 19. The priest starts the prayer, and the boy's lips move. Along, barely. I watch as the priest's hand trembles when he traces the cross on the boy's forehead. Then I kneel, as always, and give the morphine. He jerks slightly at the needle's prick. It's the most he's moved in hours. Sometimes I think of us like undertakers in reverse, preparing the living for the moment they leave, dressing their suffering instead of their bodies. At the 13th bed, death wins. The priest kneels, says the rite, but I don't need to check for a pulse. I know, the waxy sheen to the skin, the open mouth frozen mid-breath, the stillness that no drug or word can interrupt. He's gone. Another one added to the tally, though no one counts anymore. What's the point? The dead are endless. Numbers don't change that. A stretcher team will come soon. They'll pull the sheet over the man's face. Another blank, white, goodbye. And then we'll boil his cot, scrub the floor, burn his linens. It's all routine now, like laundering socks or changing bandages, but heavier, always heavier. We move on. Outside, the sky begins to darken, though it's only mid-afternoon. A storm perhaps, or just the gloom of winter swallowing the light early again. I pull my shawl tighter around my shoulders, though I know the cold has little to do with weather. By the 34th bed, my hands have gone numb. Each breath I take behind this mask is hot and sour, the cloth damp from hours of use. The morphine in my pocket is almost gone. I'll need to restock. Again. I wonder how long we can keep rationing it. We've already cut doses in half, then into quarters. Soon it'll be like giving water and pretending it's medicine. The priest sighs beside me. His voice cracks on the last name, and he stops for a moment, bowing his head. I place a hand on his shoulder. We do not speak. There is no need. By the time we reach the last bed, we are both shivering. The man there is young, too young, 18 maybe. His cheeks are still round. He has a photograph pinned to the canvas above him. A girl with ribboned curls and an eye note that says, "Don't forget me." He stares at it as we approach, his breath rattling like dried leaves in a winter wind. The priest begins, and I, one step behind death, do what I have done too many times before. I wipe the boy's forehead. I inject the morphine. I whisper, "It's all right, love. You can rest now." The boy's eyes flutter once, then close. When we finally step outside, night has fallen. The snow has thickened into a curtain. All sound is muffled. The world feels padded, unreal. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. Once, twice, for the hour or for the dead. I can't tell anymore. The priest stands beside me, arms crossed, his breath fogging in front of him. "How long can this go on?" he asks, not looking at me. I don't answer, because because we both already know. As long as there are still beds to fill, still men to hold down as their lungs fail, still one more heartbeat to chase, until then we will walk this path, him with his crucifix, me with my needle, always one step behind death. Will she be coming soon? March 1919, civilian influenza infirmary, south of Reims, France. There are days when I wonder if the walls of this place remember, not the walls of canvas and timber out in the field hospitals, but these real ones, stone and plaster, etched with the passing of 1,000 hands. This old schoolhouse was turned into a ward in a hurry last October, its desks carted off to make space for rows of cots. The chalkboards are still here though, one in each room. Above the rows of patients, you can still see remnants of arithmetic problems and conjugated French verbs faintly scrawled in chalk, ghosts of lessons past, now lingering over the dying. This room is for civilians, mostly women, a few men, but now, more and more, children. The youngest don't understand what's happening. They're wrapped in scratchy blankets too big for their bodies, limbs limp and eyes glassy with fever, coughing until their ribs threaten to snap. Their cries come not from pain, but from something worse. Confusion. The absence of the familiar. They want the comfort of a face they know, and most of them don't get it. She's in the last cot on the left. 10, maybe, no more. The kind of child who might have once scraped her knees chasing chickens, or been scolded for sneaking extra jam when her mother wasn't looking. Her hair is fine, and dark and tangled, falling across her forehead like a curtain. The tag on her bed says Marie-Thérèse in neat cursive. Beneath it, a note, mother admitted, status unknown. She's quiet, like most of the others now. The early days of fever bring noise, crying, shouting, begging. But as it worsens, they grow still, like flowers bent under snow. I sit beside her with the bowl of water. It's lukewarm. The stove gave up hours ago, and there's no more coal. I wring the cloth slowly and press it against her forehead. Her skin is burning, but her fingers are ice. I glance at her breathing, shallow and fast, the chest rising in short bursts. Her lungs are fighting, but not winning. Her eyes flicker open. They are grey-blue, washed out by the illness, but still bright enough to reflect the sunlight trickling through the cracked window. She turns her head slightly, lips parting. "Madame," she whispers, her voice hoarse as dry leaves. Will my mama be coming soon? I pause. It's the kind of question that cleaves through you, sharper than any bone saw or bullet. I feel it deep, not just as a nurse, but as a sister, as a daughter, as someone who's been waiting for someone to walk through a door and say everything's fine now. I could lie. I've lied before. She's on her way. She sent her love. She's resting, just like you. But today, I don't know. I don't know if Marie's mother is down the hallway or buried behind the church. So instead, I give her something gentler. She'd be here if she could, I whisper, brushing a strand of hair from her damp cheek. She loves you more than anything. Marie nods faintly. Her eyelids droop again, but she smiles. Small, soft, the kind of smile that shatters you. I stay beside her as the coughing begins again, wet and rasping. She clutches a rag to her mouth. When she pulls it away, I see the stain, bright red, stark against the white linen. Blood. I press the cloth to her lips again, whispering, "Just breathe, little one." is rattling. The sound is unmistakable now. I've heard it too many times. It's the rattle of fluid deep in the lungs, where air should be. The beginning of drowning from the inside out. And there's nothing left I can do. No medicine. No miracle. Just time and presence. I reach for the morphine. Children get less. Sometimes just a drop. Just enough to smooth the edges of pain. But I give her more than usual. She deserves peace, not fear. The injection goes in, and within moments, she's still. The rattle softens. Her breaths grow slower. Her small hand reaches toward mine, fingers curling around two of my own. Her skin is cold, but her grip is surprisingly strong. She does not speak again. Minutes pass, maybe more. Time in this place bends, stretches, folds over itself. But I do not leave. I stay with her, hand in hand, as the light from the window moves across the floor like the shadow of a sundial. Then, a final breath, a flutter, and stillness. Her hand slips from mine. I sit back, throat tight, chest aching. I've seen death every day for months, but it never stops hurting. Not like this, not with the little ones. I stand slowly, pull the sheet up to her chin. I don't cover her face yet. I want to remember her smile. That small, brave smile when she asked about her mother. I take the chalk from the board nearby, still dusty from when this was a schoolroom. On the corner of the wooden frame, I write her name, Marie-Thérèse. Age 10, brave heart. It's not much, but it's more than a ledger entry. It's more than forgotten. Outside, a church bell rings once. A carriage rumbles by, headed towards the cemetery. Another cart of bodies. Another day. I turn back, hands stained with iodine and ash, apron damp with tears and water. There are still others. Still beds to tend. Still children to hold. I do what I've done every day. I wipe my hands, and I move on. The hymn. April 1919. Temporary ward, converted monastery, northern France. We had commandeered a monastery for the overflow. The stone chapel had been hastily cleared of pews, the altar draped in a canvas tarp, and the ancient halls now echoed not with prayers but with coughs, groans, and the quiet, unrelenting shuffle of rubber soles on cold tile. We were told the building was nearly 300 years old, and I believed it. Everything smelled of old wax and damp limestone. The crucifixes remained on the walls. We left them. Nobody had the heart to take them down. The man in bed 17 arrived 2 nights ago, brought in from a field station in Montreuil. He was barely conscious then, swaddled in layers of tattered uniform, his boots still caked in spring mud. I don't think he knew where he was. One of the orderlies said he had been found wandering the outskirts of the town, disoriented and shivering, speaking nonsense in short bursts. They didn't even have a name for him. No tags, no papers, just a worn Bible in the inner pocket of his coat and a crumpled scrap of paper with what looked like part of a psalm written in charcoal. The fever had taken hold swiftly. When I first leaned over his cot, he was already drenched in sweat, his eyes fluttering beneath purple lids, lips moving without sound. His face was young, but war had aged it. Thin, too thin. His ribs pushed up against the fabric of his shirt, like scaffolding through a torn curtain. His breathing came in ragged gulps, wet, erratic, like someone drawing water through a cracked straw. I did what I always did, wiped his brow, sponged down his arms, whispered softly into the fever. Sometimes they dusky grey-green, shadows stretching across the floor like twisted vines. I was making my rounds, checking pulses, lifting lids, marking the dead. And then, faint at first, I heard it, a voice, low, trembling, broken, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. I turned, bed 17. He was sitting up, barely, propped by some miracle of instinct, his hands gripping the sides of the cot, eyes wide and glazed, staring not at me, but past me, through the wall, through time. The hymn spilled from him like a broken prayer. The words trembled, but they were steady enough to recognise. The old ones always sang that one. Soldiers too, when they were dying, when they thought they were, and when they wished they were, e'en though it be a cross, that raiseth me. I sat beside him, resting a hand on his arm. He didn't notice. His skin was burning, flushed the colour of boiled wine. Sweat clung to every strand of hair, running in rivulets down his temples. His lips cracked with each word, but he kept going. Still all my song shall be. I whispered his name, or tried to, but there was none. So I just said, soldier, soft and gentle, like a lullaby. Nearer, my God, to thee. He blinked once, slowly, then looked at me, and for a moment, just a flicker, I thought he saw me, really saw me, like the curtain had parted between his world and mine. Elizabeth, he whispered, it wasn't my name. I held his hand anyway. His body began to tremble. The fever was mounting again. His breathing hitched, turning shallow. His shoulders hunched, forward, spasming with every breath. Blood speckled his lips, then streamed. He coughed, choking, eyes wide, pupils blown wide like black holes. But even through the choking, he kept singing, nearer to thee. The last note trembled off his tongue like a moth in the dark. Then silence, his eyes fixed on something far away. His chest rose once more, and then stillness. The hymn hung in the air like incense, weightless, holy, unbearable. I closed his eyes with 2 fingers, then pressed the damp sheet over his face. The crucifix above his bed tilted slightly, crooked, a relic bearing witness. The others had stopped to listen. Some nurses, some patients. A few turned their faces to the wall. One began to cry quietly, her back to the room. There were no rites, no family, no name, just a song, and the echo it left behind. A moment alone. May 1919, rear hospital grounds outside Amiens. The ward never slept, not really. It only dozed, fitfully, fretfully, caught somewhere between a prayer and a moan. Day and night had lost all meaning inside those walls. Light filtered in through grime-streaked windows. The same grey hue at dawn as at dusk, as if time itself refused to move forward. Lamps flickered over beds where men and women drifted between fever and delirium. The air smelled of alcohol, sweat, wet gauze, and the iron tang of blood. Always blood. We moved through it like shadows, the nurses, quiet, efficient, always one foot in the world of the living, one toe dipped in the realm of the dying. By the end of my shift, my hands were trembling so badly, I nearly dropped the last tray of kidney basins. I hadn't eaten in 10 hours. I couldn't remember the last proper meal, but it wasn't hunger gnawing at me. It was the weight, the unrelenting, invisible weight. It had settled on my shoulders weeks ago and refused to let go. It pushed down with every cough, Just one breath. I slipped out through the back corridor, past the chapel-turned morgue, down the narrow stone steps that led to the rear grounds. The door creaked open, too loud after so much silence. And then I was out. Outside, the air hit me like a slap. Cool. Damp. Real. For a moment, I just stood there, my chest rising and falling too fast, lungs unused to anything but the stifling thickness of the ward. I felt the breeze slip through the fabric of my dress, cool against the sweat clinging to my skin. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, twice, then fell silent. The garden had once been beautiful. Someone told me the nuns had grown. Herbs here, before the war and the plague. Now the soil was overgrown, untended, run wild with weeds and rusted wheelbarrows. I walked slowly to the edge of the wall. Ivy clung to the crumbling stone. I braced my hands against it and stared out at the empty field beyond. The grass swayed in the wind like a sea, green and gold, untouched, pure. The sun was trying to break through a layer of grey clouds, weak and watery, like an apology. And then, only then, I reached up and pulled my mask down. The ties caught in my hair. I didn't care. The moment the fabric left my face, I gasped, not from relief, but from release. My lips trembled, and I pressed them shut hard, as if I could hold it in. But I couldn't. The tears came quickly, hot, silent, furious. I didn't sob. I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I was somewhere they couldn't hear. Somewhere the patients couldn't see. They needed me strong. They needed me clean, competent, kind. The steady hand that brought the morphine, that whispered comfort into the dark, the one who never broke. But out here, no one was watching. My shoulders shook as the tears slipped down my cheeks, streaking the dust and sweat. I covered my face with both hands, as if trying to hide from even the sky. But the sky didn't care. Neither did the wind. All I could see behind my closed eyes were faces. So many faces. The young girl who called out for her mother with her final breath. The soldier who sang hymns until the fever carried him away. The baby who was brought in blue-lipped and gone before I could even sponge her forehead. The man who whispered a name that wasn't mine. The priest who gave last rites with hands trembling worse than mine. And my brother. I hadn't let myself think of him since the letter came last week. Ill, it said. Just that. He is ill. No details, no word since. I had folded the letter neatly and kept working. What else could I do? Now, finally, it broke free. The guilt, the dread, the helpless fury. I dug my nails into my palms, trying to steady myself, trying to remember how to breathe. But the air wouldn't stay. It came in ragged, gasping pulls. A sparrow landed on the wall near me. It cocked its head, blinked once and flew off. I envied it for a moment. The freedom, the unknowing. Behind me, the door creaked again, a sound that meant someone was coming. I wiped my face quickly on my sleeve, retied the mask, smoothed my apron with hands still shaking. I took one last look at the field. Then I turned back toward the door. Back into the world of the dying. Back into the ward where silence and suffering lay side by side. Back into the job I could not abandon. The mask covered my face again. The tears had stopped, but the ache had only deepened. One less pair of hands. June 1919. Ward 3. Emergency influenza. Infirmary, northern France. It was just past 4 in the morning, though the time barely mattered anymore. The days bled together like watercolours left in the rain, indistinct, fragile, and damp with sorrow. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale in the east, the first hints of dawn smearing across the horizon, but the light never reached inside the ward. Not truly. In here, the world remained dim and heavy, wrapped in the sour, sweet stench of sweat and chloroform, of unwashed bodies and decaying breath. I moved automatically now, hour after hour, patient after patient. Dip the cloth, sponge the forehead, check the pulse, change the bedding, refill the basin, pull the sheet over the dead, mark the name, on to the next. I'd long since stopped counting the hours, but I could feel their toll in my body, in the dull ache in my shoulders, in the black crescents beneath my eyes, in the way my hands trembled when I paused long enough to notice them. Clara was 2 steps behind me, moving from bed to bed in tandem. We had worked together since the winter, since the first wave swelled into a tide that never receded. She had auburn hair, always pulled into a severe bun that loosened by noon, freckles dusting her cheeks like old constellations. There was a quiet resilience to her, the kind that didn't crack easily. I'd watched her stitch a boy's split chest back together without flinching. I'd seen her sing softly to a dying toddler when the mother couldn't be found. She never talked much, but when she did, it mattered. We hadn't spoken in hours. We rarely did anymore. There was no time. At bed 47, I reached for the man's wrist. Cold. Too cold. I didn't need to check twice. Clara, I said gently, not looking up. Another sheet. She nodded wordlessly and moved to the supply cabinet. We had no fresh linens left. She brought one of the last clean ones, still damp from being boiled an hour earlier. We worked in silence, tucking it over the man's still form, smoothing it flat over the curve of his chest. I whispered a name. She folded his arms across his chest. We turned to move on. That's when it happened. A soft sound, a half-stifled gasp, like a punctured breath, and then a dull thud. I whipped around just in time to see Clara crumple to the floor. At first I thought she'd tripped. Her hands had been shaking worse than mine lately. She'd been pushing herself too hard, skipping her breaks, refusing rest. But then I saw her face. Grey. Not the grey of exhaustion. The grey of something deeper. Something wrong. She blinked, once slowly, her eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on the ceiling beams. Her lips parted like she meant to say something, a word, a warning, a farewell. But nothing came. I dropped to my knees beside her, my own breath hitching in my throat. Clara, I whispered, my voice catching. She blinked again, slower this time. Her pupils didn't track me, and then, just before the others rushed over, she turned her head just slightly and looked straight at me. Her eyes met mine. For the briefest second, the noise of the ward fell away. No moans, no coughing, no rattling breaths. Just the two of us, the silence between us like a fragile thread stretched across the world. I saw it all in her gaze. The fear, the exhaustion, the resignation, but also something else. Relief. And then the moment shattered. 2 orderlies came, lifting her gently, murmuring words that didn't register. One of the other nurses, Yvette, the youngest, helped steady Clara's head as they carried her toward the infirmary tent. I stood frozen, watching them go. She didn't look back. She wouldn't be back. We all knew it. No one said it aloud, but it was there, thick in the air like smoke after a fire. You didn't collapse in the ward unless it was already inside you. The fever turned slowly, my stomach tight, hands clenched. There was no time to grieve, no time to sit, to cry, to process. There were still beds to tend, patients to soothe, bodies to mark. But the world felt quieter without her. The space she left behind, that empty rhythm where she would have handed me the basin or rolled the patient's shoulders, echoed louder than the coughing, louder than the prayers. One less pair of hands, one less quiet voice in the dark. I reached the next bed and took the patient's wrist in mine. Still warm, still breathing. Work, just keep working. The mask pressed tight against my skin, soaking up the sweat and tears I couldn't spare. We didn't say goodbye in this place. We just kept going until we couldn't. The Ribbon, July 1919. Influenza Emergency Hospital, converted parish hall, Amiens, France. The ward was quieter than usual that morning. Not from any real peace, but from depletion. The kind of silence that settles after a storm. Not because the danger has passed, but because so much has already been taken. The air inside the old parish hall was heavy with the scent of carbolic acid and damp stone, a mixture I had grown so used to that I could barely notice it anymore unless I stepped outside and then returned. It clung to our uniforms, our skin, our breath, a constant reminder that we lived in a world sterilised not for healing, but for survival. The great vaulted ceilings overhead, once a space for choirs and congregations, were now lined with canvas drapes and the dim flicker of gas lamps. Rows of cots stretched beneath them, like tombstones in some grim regimented field. Spaced closely, too closely, each one holding its own private war between flesh and fever. I was making my rounds down the western aisle of beds, the ones closest to the stained glass windows, now boarded over with tar paper and linen to block the draught, when I noticed it. A faint glint of colour, something unnatural in all the monotony of white and grey and rusted iron. It was a ribbon, just a thin scrap of blue silk, no more than 3 inches long, tied gently to the metal headrail of a cot in the second row. Kind of thing a child might tie to a doll or a girl might wear in her hair. It stood out like a drop of sky fallen into ash. I stopped in front of the bed. The man lying in it, Gérard Mercier, I recalled from the ledger, was unconscious. His chest rose and fell in the uneven rhythm we'd come to know too well. The fever was high. His skin burned through the sheets, and his lips were cracked with dryness. He hadn't stirred in 2 days. I had long given up hope of him waking. And yet, the ribbon, someone had been here. It didn't happen often. Visits were discouraged, dangerous, disheartening. Most families had either already buried someone or were too afraid to come. The few who braved it wore scarves across their mouths, gloves on their hands, rosaries clutched tight in white knuckles. But someone had come for Gérard. They had come, and they had left this. I looked down the cot to where his feet were tucked, under the blanket, noting the slight twitch in his leg. A sign, maybe, that his dreams were still restless. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my apron and pulled out a small safety pin. I kept them there, mostly for mending gauze or securing rolled bandages. But this felt more important. With trembling fingers, I pinned the ribbon more, securely to the headrail, careful not to disturb the fabric. There, a mark, however small, that he had not been forgotten, that someone had come, had dared to sit beside him in the shadow of death and say goodbye. I stood for a moment longer. unsure why my throat was so tight. Maybe it was the memory of my own brother, still far away in London, or maybe already gone. The letter from home, weeks old now, the silence that followed louder than any answer. Maybe it was the way I imagined that visitor had knelt there in the night, whispered something, tucked the ribbon into place like a prayer. Maybe it was because, in the face of so much anonymity, bodies buried in mass graves, names scratched into ledgers and forgotten, this single act of remembrance felt like defiance. Behind me, someone coughed, low and rattling. I turned, snapped back to movement, and moved to the next bed. But I kept thinking about that ribbon. Later that evening, I found myself making a habit of it. Each time someone passed, I would look for any trace of the living left behind. A pressed flower, a smudged fingerprint on the rail, a name etched into the wood with a pocket knife. It wasn't protocol, but what was protocol in a place like this? By the end of the week, I had a drawer in the back of the supply closet, tucked behind. The clean linens and stacks of morphine ampoules. Inside, folded like precious things, were little remnants, torn handkerchiefs, faded snapshots, pages from letters too stained to deliver, and now, one blue ribbon. When we cleared a bed after a death, I would sometimes pin one of these scraps to the bottom rail, not for the families who might never know, but for us, for the nurses and orderlies and aides who had seen them, touched their hands, wiped their mouths, for those of us who remembered their names even after they were gone, a life reduced to a line in a death ledger, a death marked by a scrap of silk. Maybe it wasn't enough, but maybe it was something. That night, as I walked back through the ward, oil lamp in hand, I passed Gerard's bed again. He was still alive, barely, but something about the ribbon made him seem more human in the gloom. Not just another body, another tally. He was a man. Someone's husband, maybe. Someone's brother. And someone had come. I whispered a quiet blessing as I passed. Not a prayer. I wasn't religious anymore. Not really. But something closer to a promise. You were not alone. You were loved. You will be remembered. And then I moved on, into the dark, where others still waited. Let me know when you're ready for the next chapter. Oh, you said, that's brilliant. Keep that length and detail, maybe even longer if you can. Next prompt. At night, she writes names in a ledger, though most of them will never make it to a grave with a marker. The ledger, July 1919, influenza emergency hospital, converted parish hall, Amiens, France. Nightfall always came too quickly here, but it was a relief. The heat of the day was replaced by a damp, oppressive chill that seeped into the bones, and the moonlight filtering through the small gaps in the tar paper windows cast an eerie glow across the ward. The sick were quieter now, some already drifting into the stupor of sleep or fevered delirium, while others clung to their suffering like it was the last thread of life they had. It was in the hours after midnight, when the sounds of the ward softened to the rhythmic coughing and the occasional rattle of breath, that I would find myself alone at the small desk in the corner. It was a makeshift office, nothing more than an old wooden table salvaged from the church. The ink bottle was dried out, and the quills scratched like nails on a chalkboard as I dipped it into the last bit of ink I could scrape from the bottom. But still, I wrote. I always wrote. The ledger, thick and weathered from constant use, was where the names of the dead were inscribed. It was grim work. Not one of those tasks that anyone should grow accustomed to. But the months had worn me down, and by now I was too tired to feel the sting of each name. I would bend over the pages, leaning close to the flickering lamp, its small flame dancing with the draughts that snuck through the cracks in the walls. Jean Moreau, Anne Dupont, Louis Lefebvre. The names scrawled across the pages were just names, one after the other, all written in haste, with barely any space between them. Each was followed by a simple tally, the date of death and the cause: pneumonia or septic shock, respiratory failure. Sometimes, if I had the energy, I would mark a small cross beside a name. That was for those who had passed alone, who had no family to claim them, no mourners to shed a tear. Tonight, it seemed, there was a never-ending parade of them. The ink was thick and dark, and the weight of it pressed down on me. It wasn't just the names that lingered. It was the faces of those I had touched, whose hands I had held in their last moments, whose eyes I had looked into as they whispered their final words. Charlotte Lemoine, 12 years old, a fevered fever that came on so fast she couldn't even scream for help before the light in her eyes dimmed. I had wrapped her in a blanket and sat with her until her breathing stopped, her tiny body growing colder with every minute. She had smiled at me once before she fell unconscious. I wonder if it was a dream she had, one where she was running, free from the fever, free from the suffering. I wiped my brow with the back of my sleeve. My hands were trembling now, but not from fatigue. It was something deeper, something older. The weight of the names, the faces, and the silence that followed. These people would never be buried in a plot with a stone to mark their passing. Not here. Not in a place like this, where the graves were dug in haste, the bodies wrapped in linen and shoved into shallow earth, covered over with dirt too quickly to matter. And it was this silence that tormented me most. I turned the page in, the ledger and the soft sound of the paper brushing against itself was like the faintest cry in the night. There were so many of them, too many, and so many who had passed without anyone to claim them, without anyone to give them the dignity of a name spoken with love or grief. No one would ever come to visit them at a grave, no flowers or tears left at their headstones. In the end, they were just gone. Eugene Moreau was one of them, a young man, barely 20, who had come to us in the early days of the outbreak, but by the time the fever had taken hold, he was too weak to even lift his head. He had spent his final hours muttering in delirium, calling for his mother, even though she had died years ago. I remembered holding his hand, feeling the roughness of his skin and the sweat that poured from his brow. His body was warm, but his soul was already somewhere else, far away from the suffering of this place. I paused for a moment, staring at the ledger, as though the names on the page could somehow come to life again if I just stared long enough. But there was no magic in this, no resurrection, no miracle. They were gone, and all I could do was write their names down. The clock on the wall ticked quietly in the background, marking the passage of time, and for a fleeting moment I wondered how long I could keep this up, how long I could keep going when there were so many names that would never be properly mourned, so many souls that would slip through the cracks of history, never to be remembered. My own brother's name perhaps would soon join them in anonymity. I had not heard from home in weeks. The silence was louder than any words could be. But still, I wrote, René Vaillant, Marc Lefebvre, Etienne Thomas. I didn't know if they would ever be remembered outside of these these pages, but I knew I would remember them. The ones who died alone, the ones whose hands I had held, the ones whose names were nothing but a whisper now. I finished the last line and closed the ledger with a soft thud, my hand resting on the worn cover. The room was quiet now, save for the sound of the wind rattling the windows and the occasional cough from the ward. There were more names to come, and I knew it. But for now, in the stillness of the night, I allowed myself one moment to close my eyes and remember them all. The ones who had lived, the ones who had died, and those who would never know that someone had cared enough to write their names down. Tomorrow there would be more names, but for now I let the silence hang heavy as I bowed my head alone in the dark. A moment of hope, July 1919. Influenza Emergency Hospital, converted Parish Hall, Amiens, France. The day had begun like any other. The usual wave of fatigue swept over me as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls. I hadn't slept for more than a few hours in days, but the constant rhythm of the work had become as familiar to me as the sound of my own breathing. The coughs, the gasps, the rattle of lungs filling with fluid. They were all part of the symphony now. It had been so long since I had seen anything else, but then it happened. The moment I entered the ward, I saw her. Lucienne Dufresne. She had been bedridden for nearly 2 weeks, lying motionless as the fever ravaged her small body. Her face was a portrait of pale desperation, eyes sunken, lips cracked and dry, skin the colour of wax. For days she had hovered between life and death, each breath laboured, each second seeming to stretch endlessly into the next. I had held her hand, wiped her brow, and whispered assurances that I didn't believe myself. "You'll be all right. You're strong." But I knew, just as she knew, that we had no real idea if she would pull through. Yet this morning, when I walked to her bed, something was different. She was awake. Her eyes, though still clouded with fever, were clear. There was a spark of life in them that hadn't been there for days. Her breathing was steady, her pulse strong, not frantic, not ragged. The change was subtle at first, like the slow but undeniable breaking of a storm cloud. But it was enough. It was enough for me to stop in my tracks, to allow myself that fleeting breath of hope that had long been absent from this place. Lucienne. My voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. I didn't want to disturb the delicate balance of whatever had shifted inside her. She turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing on me with an effort that made my heart skip. And then, there it was, the faintest of smiles. It was so small, so fragile, that for a moment I wasn't sure it was real. But then she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable, I think I'm going to be all right." I hadn't heard those words in what felt like an eternity. We had seen so many slip away, each one colder than the last, each one more impossible to let go. But here, in the midst of all this death, Lucienne was alive. She was recovering. I found myself grinning, a wide, genuine smile. I hadn't allowed myself such a thing in so long. The weight of her recovery, the possibility that this time, against all odds, someone was going to make it, filled me with a warmth I couldn't suppress. The smile spread across my face before I even realised it. The joy of witnessing a life being reclaimed, a soul coming back from the brink. But then, like the bitter gust of wind that sweeps through a room, just as you think the fire might be enough to warm it, mouths that rattled their chests, the faces that were paler than the ones I had just seen go cold. Lucienne's recovery, so rare, so miraculous, was nothing but a sharp contrast to the suffering that surrounded her. I glanced at the floor, my smile faltering, crumbling under the weight of the world I had momentarily forgotten. How could I smile when there were so many still dying? How could I allow myself even a moment of joy when so many were still in the depths of this hell? The guilt was suffocating. The guilt that I had felt this, that I had allowed myself to hope. The guilt that Lucienne's recovery, her moment of light, had drawn my attention away from the others who still needed me. Was I betraying them by feeling even a fraction of happiness? By smiling when they were still suffering? I walked to Lucienne's bedside, trying to hide the conflict inside me, trying to mask the turmoil that churned beneath my calm exterior. I reached down to touch, her hand squeezing it gently. "You're doing well, Lucienne. I'm so proud of you," I whispered, my voice now betraying the emotion I had so carefully kept in check. Her eyes closed for a moment, and she nodded, as if understanding. She didn't speak again, but her grip tightened around my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we shared in this fight. I could feel her breath steadying, could feel the strength returning to her fragile form. She was fighting, and she was winning. But as I walked away to continue my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed. Failed by feeling anything other than sorrow for the others, who still remained tethered to their sickness, their suffering. The guilt clung to me like the suffocating heat in the room, thick and ever-present, suffusing everything I did with a sense of wrongness. Why had she survived? Why had I smiled when so many others, like her, were slipping away? I could feel it gnawing at me, but I pushed it aside. I had no time for it. Not now. There was still so much to be done, but it lingered, like a shadow, creeping at the edges of my thoughts as I moved from bed to bed. It wasn't the kind of guilt I could easily explain, not the kind I could speak about aloud. It was just the feeling that, in a place like this, in a moment like this, happiness had no place. I looked back once more at Lucienne's bed, at the small rise and fall of her chest, steady and strong now, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself another smile, small and quiet, like the gentle flicker of hope that could never fully be extinguished. Then, with a deep breath, I turned away. The work was still waiting for me, and so were the others, the smiles and the guilt. They would have to wait. The Weight of Dreams, August 1919, Influenza Emergency Hospital, Converted Parish Hall, Amiens, France. The light was soft when I closed my eyes, and the weight of the hospital's suffocating air began to drift away. For a brief moment, I was no longer a nurse, no longer wrapped in layers of responsibility, surrounded by the dead and dying. The smell of sickness and fear clinging to everything. I was, for the first time in what felt like years, just a girl again. The dreams were fleeting, soft, like the touch of a hand I hadn't felt in a long time. I found myself in a place where the sky stretched endlessly overhead, pale blue and limitless. A field spread out before me, the earth dark and rich beneath my bare feet, the sweet, damp scent of fresh soil rising to meet me. The tall grass swayed in the gentle breeze, undisturbed by the tremors of war and illness that had invaded my waking hours. My childhood dog, a sturdy little terrier with a black patch over one eye, darted playfully through the field, tail wagging furiously, as he always had when we were young. His fur was soft beneath first, then harder. The kind of rain that brought the earth to life, made everything smell clean again. Ran then, barefoot and free, through the field, laughing as the rain soaked my clothes, my hair, my skin. I could taste the earth on the air, and the warmth of the sun breaking through the grey clouds overhead. The rain didn't feel cold in the dream. It felt like home, like the summers when I would run through the rain with my brother, our parents, watching from the porch, laughter filling the space between the thunderclaps. For a brief moment, in that hazy twilight between sleep and wakefulness, I was home again, free from the weight of the world, the isolation of the hospital, the constant march of death and despair. But then, as always, the dream began to fade. The rain turned into something darker, more suffocating. The field began to grow distant, as if pulled away by invisible hands, and I felt myself sinking back into the heaviness of the air. The muffled sounds of the hospital began to press in, a cough, a murmur, the rustle of blankets, and just as I reached for the memory of my dog, for the soft fur and the laughter, the world cracked open again, pulling me back into the cold, sterile reality of the ward. The deep, dry rasp of a cough broke through the dream's remnants, dragging me awake with a sharpness that made me wince. My eyes snapped open, and the familiar, unbearable weight of the hospital descended on me like a shroud. The room was darker now, the weak light from the window barely enough to cast shadows on the walls. The blankets were stifling, clinging to my skin, and the harsh, metallic taste of antiseptic still lingered in my mouth. I sat up slowly, blinking in the half-light, my heart racing for reasons I didn't understand. The coughing fit nearby was raw, desperate, each violent spasm shaking the body of the man who lay in the bed across from mine. I could feel the weight of his illness, even without looking. The rasp of his lungs struggling to breathe, the way his chest heaved with each failed attempt to inhale. The sound like a dying thing. It was the same sound I had heard 100 times in this place. The dry, hacking cough that signalled the beginning of the end. There was no mistaking it. I had witnessed it too many times now to believe otherwise. The cough was not a sign of recovery. It was a death rattle, hollow and final, that echoed through the ward like a grim reminder of the epidemic's ruthless nature. My own lungs ached from the dry, stale air, and my throat burned from the constant strain of speaking over the noise. The endless, unbearable noise of the dying. The fevered groans, the sounds of bodies shifting in their beds, the whispers of those too weak to call out for help. It was all too much, too consuming, a never-ending tide of suffering that threatened to swallow me whole. I reached for the bedside table, fumbling for the glass of water that had been left there earlier. My hand trembled as I brought it to my lips, but the water was bitter, tasting of something old and stale. It didn't refresh me, didn't ease the dryness in my throat. The hospital's air had become a constant presence, its thick, suffocating heaviness always pressing down on my chest, blocking me from the fresh breath I so desperately craved. The cough continued, each fit drawing the man closer to the edge, but I had no power over it. I was just another body in the room, another soul wearing a mask, just one more nurse in an army of faces that blurred together, a blur of exhausted hands and hollow eyes. A part of me longed to fall back into the dream, the field, the rain, the dog, but I couldn't escape. Not now. Not when there was still work to be done, when stood up slowly, my body stiff, from lying in the same position for too long. My legs wobbled and I felt dizzy, the weight of the exhaustion pressing down on me, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. The world outside the ward was out of reach, a memory that no longer had meaning. I crossed to the patient's bed, my feet silent on the worn floorboards. He was still coughing, his body racked with each spasm, his face contorted in agony. I had seen this before. I had seen it too many times. The dream, with its soft rain and childhood warmth, was already slipping away from me, a distant, unreachable place. And so I leaned over him, pressing my hand to his forehead, wiping the sweat from his brow. I whispered words I no longer believed. "You'll be all right. We'll help you through this. Just breathe." The coughs continued, unyielding, and once more the dream faded, dissolving into the darkness of the ward, where hope seemed like an impossibility. The endless struggle. August 1919. Influenza Emergency Hospital, converted parish hall, Amiens, France. The weight of the shift had never felt so heavy. The silence between the screams and the desperate coughs suffocating. My feet dragged on the worn floor as I made my way to the locker room, my apron soaked with sweat and the unmistakable scent of antiseptic. I could feel the exhaustion weighing on me, pulling at the very marrow of my bones. Each step felt like it took all the strength. I had left, but I knew there was no choice. There was always more to do. Another patient, another body to be turned, another fever to be tended to. I could hear the distant murmurs of the other nurses as they shuffled through the same motions. It was an unspoken understanding, a collective fatigue that bound us all. We didn't need words to convey the weight of what we were carrying. But now, at the end of my shift, my body screamed for rest. My shoulders ached from the constant tension of holding up the mask, from the weight of my own breath as I struggled to breathe through the layers of cloth, gauze and fear. I had watched too many faces fade into lifelessness, too many bodies stiffen with the quiet inevitability of death, each one reminding me that there was no end to it. Not here, not in this place. As I passed the sterile hallways lined with cots and empty beds, the air seemed thicker, heavier, like the very atmosphere of the hospital had absorbed the grief of the days before. The walls, once white and pure, had turned a sickly shade of yellow, their cleanliness long ago marred by the perpetual chaos of the epidemic. The flickering light from the overhead bulbs cast long, unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the walls. It was a hospital, yes, but it felt more like a waiting room for the end. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, as if reluctant to leave the familiar hell behind. The coolness of the night air would be a relief, but it also felt like a betrayal. Stepping outside meant leaving the dying behind, for a moment at least. It was a constant push-pull of guilt, wanting to leave, but knowing that even for a second, I couldn't escape. There was no running from this, not anymore. I opened the door, stepping out into the dimming light of evening. The cool air felt like a shock to my senses after the stifling heat of the ward, the rush of it nearly making me gasp. I inhaled deeply, but it did little to clear the tightness in my chest. The sky was fading into a muted shade of purple, a colour that seemed to echo the dullness in my heart. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving behind a quiet stillness that only amplified the weight of my thoughts. I looked toward the street, half expecting to see the usual bustle of the town, the sounds of life that had once felt so commonplace. But now it was eerily quiet. hearses. There were at least a dozen of them, their dark, polished wood gleaming faintly in the last light of the day. Their solemnity was more than just a visual. It was an absence of life that seemed to fill the entire street, a line of vehicles parked and waiting, but for what, I couldn't say. It was as though they had no particular destination, no specific purpose other than to be there, poised in the shadows, like silent, uninvited guests at a wake. The sight of them made my stomach churn, twisting with a bitter mixture of sorrow and disbelief. Each vehicle was empty, the back doors closed, awaiting passengers who were already claimed by the virus. The hearse drivers stood by their vehicles in complete silence, their faces masked and unreadable, their movements deliberate, like they were guarding something too heavy to carry. I couldn't bring myself to look away from them. The eerie procession, stretching down the street like some twisted version of a parade. Only there would be no cheers, no accolades, no relief, only the ever-present shadow of death. For a moment, I felt like I was floating above myself, detached from the reality of the scene. The entire world seemed out of focus, a blur of emotions and events that I couldn't fully grasp anymore. The days had become a haze of patience, death, and the endless, cruel repetition of the same actions. Wipe the brow, administer morphine, check for fever, repeat. It felt like the dead were simply passing through, leaving nothing behind but their empty shells and their stories that no one would remember. The trucks had come to collect the bodies, a routine, an expected task, but in that moment it seemed grotesque. The precision of it, the inevitability. I knew what would happen next. They would be loaded onto the hearses, their bodies wrapped in white sheets, folded neatly like forgotten laundry. No one would mourn them in the way they deserved. No one would weep. They would be buried quickly, efficiently, with the same sterile respect as the linens they'd once slept in. I swallowed the lump in my throat, but it wouldn't go away. A tear slipped down my cheek, unwelcome and foreign. I wiped it away hastily, but it seemed to linger there, a stark reminder of the human I still tried to be, despite the walls I had built around my heart. My mind was a battlefield, a war between the woman I used to be and the nurse I had become, hardened, detached, broken, but still here, still breathing, still capable of caring. Yet every day I felt myself slipping farther away from the person who had walked into this place months ago, eager to help, full of hope. Now, all that remained was a hollow version of myself, lost amidst the tide of bodies that had come and gone. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the hearses, I knew I would go back inside. I would pick up my mask again, wipe my hands, administer my care, because that was all I knew now. That was all that was left for me. I had no choice but to keep going. I had no choice but to keep tending to the dying, even if, for every life I saved, there were 10 more waiting for my care, 10 more I couldn't reach in time, and the hearses would wait for them too, just as they were waiting now. One by one, their bodies would be collected, lined up, and taken away, each soul disappearing into the night, marked only by the empty vehicle and the heavy silence that followed. My shift was over, but the weight of it would never leave me, and the hearse drivers stood waiting, just as I always would. The last request, October 1918, Influenza Emergency Hospital, Madrid, Spain. The night was always the worst. The fevered, restless patients seemed to wake from their delirium As the darkness pressed in, their minds consumed by confusion and fear, and it was during those long, brutal hours, when the sounds of coughing and groaning filled the silence like a constant hum, that the worst of my shift would always unfold. I had been working for days without sleep, but there was no time for rest, no time for anything but the endless parade of bodies that moved through the ward. Some were recovering, a rare few, their faces flushed with the relief of a fever breaking, but most were slipping away, fading from this world with a quietness that only the plague could bring. They left without ceremony, their last breath stolen from them in the dead of night, their bodies left to cool as the hospital's corridors filled with the rush of footsteps, the scurry of the others who still had to be seen. It was after midnight when I entered the room of a man who had been with us for what felt like forever. A small, frail figure in his 50s, his skin pale, his breath shallow. I had seen him slip in and out of consciousness more times than I could count, but this time I knew. I could feel it in the air, in the way his chest barely moved, as if every breath was a fragile thread holding him to life. His wife was there, sitting in a chair at his bedside, her hands clasped tightly together, her face worn and tear-streaked. She hadn't left his side in days. I couldn't remember a time when she wasn't there, her soft sobs barely audible beneath the cacophony of the sick and the dying. She was pale too pale, too tired, too lost in this wretched place. But love, it seemed, was the one thing that could carry her through, even here, even in the face of this terrible epidemic. The man's eyes fluttered open when I approached, the fever dimming the clarity in his gaze, but still holding on to something familiar, something human. He reached out for her hand, and she was there instantly, her fingers trembling as she held his, her voice low and comforting, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes, the fear that clung to her every move. I stepped back, allowing them a moment, but I couldn't ignore the inevitable. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, the silence between the raspy breaths and the whispering of the nurses at the door. "Doctor," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. He was slipping. The fever had taken him to the edge, and I could see it. The telltale signs of the end. But the man's next words, weak as they were, sent a shiver through my body. "Promise me," he said, his voice hoarse, cracked from days of struggle. "Promise me you'll let her go." I didn't understand at first. I knelt down beside his bed, trying to catch his gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Let her go, sir?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "She's too tired," he whispered, his hand tightening around hers in a desperate grasp. "She's been here too long. She hasn't eaten, hasn't slept. Tell her I'm sorry. I can't go on like this." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I held them back. It wasn't my place to cry, not in this place, not in front of them. But his words, they haunted me. I had seen it before. The toll the disease took, not only on the body, but on the spirit. The exhaustion of watching someone you love fight for each breath. The torment of helplessness. The way it broke you down, piece by piece. His wife leaned closer to him, her tears already falling, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. She was too tired, too afraid. She knew what was happening. We all did. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the depth of the love they shared. The kind of love that had once carried them through so many years together, but was now being tested smoothest way imaginable, and I knew in that instant what I had to do. I knelt beside them, pressing my hand to the woman's arm gently. "He's asking you to take care of yourself," I said softly, barely above a whisper. "He's worried about you." Her eyes were wide, stricken with grief, but I could see the conflict in them. It wasn't that she didn't understand. It was that she couldn't bring herself to let go. I watched as she nodded, just slightly, her breath catching as she whispered her husband's name. The man's body was beginning to stiffen, the strength leaving him even as the fever raged on, but his hand, still clasped around his wife's, held on a little longer. I felt the moment stretch between us, like a silent, unspoken plea for release. She had to let him go, for both their sakes. The disease would take him either way. It always did. I looked at him, knowing what I had to do. I turned to leave, giving them space to say their final words. But before I could reach the door, I heard his voice again. "Promise me," he rasped, his breath so shallow now. "Promise me you'll tell her I love her." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion, my heart breaking for them both. "I will," I whispered. "I promise." When I left the room, the woman was still beside him, her head bent low, her sobs filling the silence that I had left behind. I didn't need to look back to know what would happen. He would pass quietly, like so many others had before him. A gentle fading, a loss that went unmarked by any ceremony but the quiet absence of breath. And in the morning, his wife would return to the same chair, her grief still too raw to bear, but now with the weight of her own survival to reckon with. Later, I would write down his name in the ledger, his date of death added to the list of many others. It was all so routine now. The names, the faces, the bodies. The influenza was a plague of endless faces, their stories fading into nothingness. But in that room, I knew there was something that wouldn't fade. The love between them, the last wish he had made. It would stay with me forever, and I would carry that with me as I moved on, as I tended to the next patient, as I continued through the night. Because sometimes, even in the face of death, love was the one thing that didn't die. The weight of empty hands. November 1918. Influenza Emergency Hospital, converted schoolhouse, Madrid, Spain. There is a strange stillness that comes after the chaos, an empty kind of quiet that fills the room after the last breath is taken, after the last heart has stopped beating. The air feels different in those moments, heavier, thicker, somehow, as if the death has left an imprint on the very space it occupied. And the silence that follows is not one of peace. It is a silence filled with all the things unsaid, all the things left behind. I had seen it before, but it never got easier. Tonight, though, it felt different. The war was quieter than usual. The usual chorus of coughs and groans replaced with the soft hum of the lamplight, casting long shadows on the walls. It was the time when most of the patients had fallen into fitful sleep, their bodies too exhausted to do anything but rest or die. I couldn't tell which it was more of these days. The line between the two seemed thinner than I could bear. Was sitting at my station, my hands folded on the desk before me, but I wasn't writing. I hadn't written anything in hours. My pen felt heavier than it should have. The ledger sat before me, an ever-present reminder of the endless stream of names, each one a life that had flickered out in this miserable place. I was supposed to be recording the deaths, the times of their passing, their last words, but all I could do was stare at the empty spaces in between, wondering how many more I would have to write in before the night was over. The coughs had become less frequent, but that only meant one thing: that the worst was over, or the worst was about to begin. I looked up when I heard the shuffle of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Another nurse walked past my station, her face gaunt with exhaustion, her eyes hollow and distant. She paused when she saw me, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might speak, but then she simply nodded, the kind of nod that said everything and nothing all at once. "I think we've lost another," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Room 7. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. It was the kind of news that had become so commonplace, so routine, that the words had no weight anymore. I knew exactly who she meant. A young woman, barely 20, who had been with us for days, her fever spiking higher with each hour, her body growing weaker and weaker. She had a husband, a child. I didn't know their names. I didn't even know hers, but I knew her face. I remembered it clearly. The soft, round cheeks, the dark eyes that had once held so much life, now clouded by illness, by the poison of the flu that had slowly taken her from us. She had fought so hard. I had thought for sure she would make it, but this disease had no mercy, and her body had given in before the morning. I stood up, feeling the weight of my legs, the weariness that pulled at my muscles. I had been on my feet for hours, but that was nothing new. We were all like that now, walking shadows, bodies that moved only because there was no choice. The constant ebb and flow of patients had drained the life out of us, leaving us hollow, empty. Room 7. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face the room where another person had slipped away without a whisper, without anyone to hold their hand as they crossed into whatever lay beyond. But I couldn't leave it. I couldn't leave her there, alone, without anyone to mark her passing. When I reached the door, I paused. The silence inside was oppressive. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, my shoes making no sound on the worn wood. The body was already covered with a sheet, the shape beneath it hauntingly still. But it wasn't the body that I looked at. It was the empty bed beside her, the empty cradle that had been pushed into the corner, its rocking motion a soft, broken promise. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I saw the small, crumpled blanket, the abandoned toys, the discarded bottle. I saw what was left behind. The hope, the future that would never be. The baby that had never known its mother, never felt her touch, never heard her voice. I had seen death so many times in this place, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever left me with such a crushing weight. She had a child who would never know her, who would grow up with only stories and memories, if anyone was left to tell them. I felt a knot form in my throat. It was a small thing, a child, and yet it was everything. It was the promise of the future, the hope that came with new life, the thing that this disease had no respect for, the thing it had taken with such cruel indifference. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the image, but it was no use. It stayed with me, haunting me. The emptiness of the cradle, the silence of the room, the absence of a mother's love. I walked over to the bed, my hands trembling as I adjusted the sheet over her. I didn't want to touch her, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to disturb the stillness, the finality of it. But I had no choice. deserve something. Something to mark her passing, to acknowledge that she had existed, even if only for a short time. I reached for the ledger in my pocket and made my way to the door. There were no words for her, nothing I could say to ease the ache that was growing in my chest. I could only write her name, add it to the list, and pray that someone, somewhere, would remember her, that someone would remember that she had loved and had been loved in return, even if it was for only a moment. As I left the room, I closed the door softly behind me. The sound of it was final, and in that moment I knew that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The child was still out there, still waiting. The fear that lingers. October 1918. Influenza. Emergency hospital. Converted schoolhouse. Madrid, Spain. It is strange the way fear begins as something small, a flicker at the back of your mind, and then, without warning, it grows into something that fills the spaces between every breath, every thought. At first, I didn't think it would get to me. I had seen it all. The fevered bodies writhing in bed, the desperate coughs, the sounds of death itself scratching at the walls. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could be strong. But the longer I spent here, in the cold, sterile halls of this hospital, the more that nagging feeling crept up on me. The others seemed to carry it with them too. A quiet, unspoken dread, a worry that each day might be their last. We were all soldiers in this unseen war, fighting a disease that didn't care who we were or how many lives we'd saved before. The flu didn't discriminate. It didn't care if you were a nurse, a doctor, a soldier, or a mother. It simply took what it wanted. I hadn't told anyone yet. The fear that had started to gnaw at me, I kept it to myself, buried deep where I thought it wouldn't hurt anyone. But as I walked down the halls tonight, my eyes scanning the rows of beds, the weight of it pressed against my chest, thick and suffocating. I had seen so many of my fellow nurses fall ill. One by one, they had succumbed to the same fate we were, all fighting to prevent. Some had gotten better, only to relapse days later. Others had slipped away quietly, leaving only an empty space in their place. There were whispers in the break room, hushed voices that spoke of those who had caught the flu and never returned. A few of them had died alone, their faces pale and twisted in agony, their hands reaching for someone who could no longer help them. I wasn't sure if it was worse, knowing they had died, or knowing that their absence was just another sign of the inevitable. I was next, I thought. I could feel it in my bones. It was only a matter of time. Tonight, the hospital felt quieter than usual. The coughs were fewer, the moans softer, as if the bodies in the beds had finally exhausted themselves. The exhaustion had become a constant companion for us all. I hadn't slept properly in days, my body aching from the long hours and the constant strain of caring for so many at once. But sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The moment I closed my eyes, the images of pale faces and laboured breathing filled my mind, and I would be awake again, unable to escape. I pulled the mask tighter against my face, the fabric itchy against my skin. I tried to ignore the tightness in my chest, the faint scratch at the back of my throat that had been there for days. I told myself it was nothing, just the dust and the dryness of the air. The thought of being sick never crossed my mind, not when I had so many others to care for. But now, as I stood by the bedside of a young woman with a high fever, her breath coming in shallow gasps, I couldn't help but wonder. I reached for the thermometer, trying to keep my hand steady. She had been with us for days now, but her condition had worsened quickly. Her fever had spiked, and she was delirious, calling out for her mother in between fits of coughing. I could hear her heart beating erratically under my fingers, feel the heat radiating from her skin. I had seen this before. It wasn't good. I took her temperature, my hands trembling slightly as I did. It had become a familiar ritual by now. One I had done hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different. My own breath felt shallow, my heart a little too quick in my chest. I held the thermometer up to the light, my stomach dropping when I saw the high number. She was worse. I could see it in her eyes. The glassy, unfocused stare that told me she was slipping away. I turned away, trying to keep my face impassive. I couldn't afford to break down, not now. Not when there were so many others depending on me. But the fear gnawed at me again. Sharper this time, more insistent. What if it was me next? What if I wasn't immune? What if I was already sick and I didn't know it yet? The thought was almost paralyzing. I could already feel the heavy weight of it settling on my chest, pushing the air from my lungs. I knew I couldn't keep working like this, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. I had to push through. I glanced around the room. The others were moving too. They were just as tired, just as worn down. There was no time to rest, no time to think about the possibility that we might catch this deadly disease. Ourselves. We couldn't afford to worry about ourselves. There was no room for it. The woman in front of me let out a weak cough, her chest rattling with the effort. I reached for the damp cloth on the bedside table and gently pressed it to her forehead, wiping away the sweat. I tried to focus on the task, to ignore the growing dread in my chest. She needed me, and I couldn't let my fear get in the way. But the fear was there, clinging to me like the very air I breathed. It was in the way I looked at the other nurses now, the way I watched their movements a little more closely, wondering if they were hiding a cough, a sniffle, a sign that they too were beginning to fall victim to the same sickness. It was in the way I checked my own breath, wondering if it sounded different, more laboured than usual. The fear had started to take root, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. The young woman's eyes fluttered, and she mumbled something I couldn't understand. I leaned closer, listening, but she had fallen back into unconsciousness, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. I stayed there for a long while, holding the cloth against her skin, listening to the sound of the other patients in the room, the soft coughing, the murmurs, the low groans that filled the air like an endless symphony of suffering. And then, as I sat there, I felt it. A brief, sharp pain in my throat. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough to stop my heart for a moment. I swallowed, trying to ease the discomfort, but the scratch remained. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the dryness of the air, the constant talking, the strain, but I couldn't ignore it. It was there, a small thing, but it was enough to make my heart skip, enough to send a wave of cold panic through my veins. I didn't want to admit it, but I had to. I was scared. I was scared I would fall too, scared that I would end up like so many of my fellow nurses, already struck down, already gone from this place without anyone to remember them but the walls, scared that I was running on empty, that the virus was already inside me and I hadn't yet realised it. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. I couldn't give in to the fear. Not when there were still so many who needed me, who needed us. So I swallowed, again, harder this time, trying to clear the sensation in my throat, the cold dread that had settled deep inside me refused to leave, but I would push through. I would keep going, one breath at a time, even if it felt like the last. Even if I was afraid I couldn't stop, not yet. The silence of the empty bed. November 1918. Influenza. Emergency hospital. Converted factory. London, England. The nights are the hardest. During the day, there's work to do, patients to tend to, wounds to dress, fluids to administer. There is always something that requires my hands, my attention, my focus. But at night, when the lights dim and the whispers of the sick phase to a dull murmur, that's when the quiet becomes unbearable. That's when the thoughts creep in, like shadows at the edge of my vision. Tonight I'm standing at the foot of a bed that should not be empty. I should not be looking down at an unoccupied mattress, at a space where a patient should be. Another sick, struggling body needing comfort, care, and hope. But there is nothing. Only silence, cold and still. She was a young woman, no more than 20, with fevered eyes and a quiet strength that spoke volumes. I remember when she first arrived, her mother clutching her hand, her face pale with worry. I tried to reassure them, though I wasn't sure how much comfort my words could offer. I could see the same fear in her mother's eyes that I had seen in so many others. The dread that came from knowing what was happening in this place. The flu was a relentless, silent predator. It crept in quickly, catching its victims off guard, suffocating them before they had time to fight back. We had seen it happen time and time again. The young and the old, the healthy and the frail. No one was safe, not even her. She had fought hard. I had watched her through the long nights, her breathing shallow but determined. She had whispered to me once when I sat beside her bed, her hand weakly reaching out to grasp mine. I want to see tomorrow. I want to see the sun again. I had smiled at her, though my heart twisted in my chest. I had promised her I would do everything I could, but in my heart I knew that I was powerless. I had seen this too many times before. I had seen the young and the strong fall just as easily as the elderly and the frail. It wasn't the age or the strength that mattered. It was the virus, and the virus was merciless. And then, just like that, she was gone. I had been with her when it happened. Her breathing had become more laboured, more strained, and I had done what I could to make her comfortable. I had adjusted the pillow beneath her head, wiped the sweat from her brow, and spoken to her softly, though I knew she couldn't hear me anymore. The moment she took her last breath was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. There were no final words, no struggle. She simply stopped. Her chest, which had been rising and falling with such effort, fell still. I stayed with her for a long time after that, my hand still resting on her cold one, even as the life left her body. I couldn't bring myself to move, to let go. The quiet in the room seemed to stretch on, swallowing everything. The sounds of the other patients, the bustle of the nurses, the usual hum of the hospital, everything faded into nothingness. I remember the moment I finally stood, leaving her side. My legs were weak, my heart heavier than it had ever been, and yet I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. I couldn't bring myself to say the words. The emptiness of the bed was too much for me to bear. I knew it wasn't the first empty bed I'd see, but something about this one, her quiet, innocent hope, the way she had clung to the idea of seeing the sun. It felt like I had failed her in some way. I had promised her something that I couldn't deliver. The other nurses saw me pass by, but no one stopped me. We had all learned not to ask each other about the ones who had gone. We didn't have the energy energy to grieve anymore. There were too many to mourn, too many to watch slip away. But it was different for me tonight. I could feel it in my bones, in the weight of the silence that followed me as I walked down the hallway, the emptiness of the bed still lingering in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder, as I moved through the hospital, how many more patients I would lose tonight. How many more empty beds would I walk past, knowing that they had once been filled with someone who had dreamed of tomorrow? The thought gnawed at me, but I didn't have time to linger. There was no time for grief here. There was only the work. The flu had taken so many, and yet the world outside seemed to carry on as if it were untouched by the tragedy unfolding within the hospital's walls. I could hear the distant sound of carriages on the street, the murmur of people talking in hushed voices, as though life were still going on as normal. But inside, in these halls, it was anything but normal. Inside, we were fighting a war, and the casualties were mounting by the hour. I passed the rows of beds again, my eyes darting over each patient as I walked. There was no rest, no reprieve. The work was endless, and yet every time I turned around, the faces of the lost seemed to haunt me. The young woman with the bright eyes, her dreams of tomorrow, now nothing more than a fading memory. I couldn't shake the feeling of her absence, the empty space where she had once been. I stopped in front of her bed, staring down at the blanket that now lay flat, a stillness settling over it. I had seen death before, but this time it felt different. This time it was personal. I ran a hand over the edge of the bed, my fingers tracing the worn fabric, and for a moment I closed my eyes. I could almost hear her voice again, her soft, desperate plea for the sun. I wished I could tell her that it would come, that tomorrow would arrive and bring with it a world of possibility. But I couldn't. Instead, I stood there in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of the patients who had passed and those who were yet to slip away, and I let myself feel the weight of it all, the weight of the lives we couldn't save, the lives that slipped through our fingers no matter how hard we tried. And when I opened my eyes again, I forced myself to move. There was more work to do, more lives to tend to, but in that moment I couldn't help but feel the absence of one. A quiet, empty space where a patient once lay, a young woman who had dreamed of seeing tomorrow, but whose tomorrow never came, and that, more than anything else, was what I couldn't forget. The weight of a promise. November 1918, influenza emergency hospital, converted schoolhouse, Paris, France. The smell of the ward is what stays with me the most. It clings to my skin, my uniform, my hair. It's a sharp, metallic scent of disinfectant mixed with the sickly, sweet smell of fevered bodies. Perspiration, illness, the sourness of something unclean that no amount of soap or air can wash away. It's in my clothes, my shoes, even under my nails. I am consumed by it, and yet I can't escape it. The smell lingers in my dreams. I can't remember the last time I had a full night's sleep, but sleep has become an unworthy pursuit. Anyway, even if I could find a moment of rest, the weight of this place would not allow it. Not with the sounds of coughing and moaning echoing in the background. Not with the ever-present hum of people teetering on the edge of life and death. The weight of their pain and their desperation hangs in the air like the fog outside, impossible to disperse. I've seen so much of death now that its edges have started to blur. Faces, names, they all become a blur after a while, but there are some that stand out, ones that I can't forget. I remember her vividly, the little than 6 or 7, who came in with her mother one afternoon, her small frame pale and trembling. She had been coughing, her little chest heaving with every breath, but she was still so full of life, so full of energy when she first arrived. Her eyes, wide with fear, searched mine when I knelt beside her bed. Her mother, a woman who looked far too young to carry so much weight, had held her hand tightly, her face drawn with anxiety. "I'll be right here," I told her softly, my hand steady despite the panic bubbling inside me. "We're going to take good care of you," the child nodded, her grip tightening on her mother's hand. I smiled, though inside I felt the same crushing weight of uncertainty that seemed to settle over everyone in the ward. The flu was a brutal enemy. It didn't discriminate, not with age, not with strength. It came for anyone who dared to breathe its air. Her condition deteriorated faster than I could have anticipated. By evening, she was struggling to keep her eyes open, her breathing shallow and irregular. I did everything I could to keep her comfortable, adjusting her pillow, offering small sips of water, and reassuring her mother with false hope. Every time I leaned over her to check her temperature, her little face seemed to grow paler, her lips more cracked, her body more fragile in my hands. Her mother never left her side, even when the pain in her eyes became too much to bear. Her fingers, once holding her child's hand tightly, now trembled with the same illness that was slowly stealing her daughter from her. "I can't lose her," the mother had whispered to me once, her voice trembling like a bird caught in a storm. "Please, not her. She's all I have left." I didn't know how to answer that. I didn't have the words to comfort her. I didn't know if I could promise that her daughter would make it through, and I had seen too many mothers broken by that same loss to lie. So I just held her hand instead, offering her my silence and my presence as the only solace I could provide. By midnight, the little girl was unconscious, her chest barely rising and falling with each laboured breath. The mother was sitting at her side, stroking her hair, whispering prayers. I watched from the doorway, my heart heavy in my chest, unable to help. It felt like hours passed before I finally approached, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. I had hoped that when I walked into the room, the girl would have shown some sign of improvement, but she hadn't. Her small body was trembling now, her skin cold to the touch. The moment her mother looked up at me, I knew there was a pain in her eyes, a deep guttural recognition that I couldn't bear to acknowledge. She knew too. The little girl's eyes flickered for just a moment, her breath stuttering before she went still. Her small, fragile form became heavy and cold in her mother's arms. I knelt beside them, pressing my fingers to the child's pulse, but I already knew it was over. I stood there, paralysed by the quietness that followed, the finality of it settling over me. The room had never felt so cold. The silence between us, broken only by the quiet sobs of the mother, felt like a weight I could not lift. Her mother, now cradling her daughter's body, looked up at me with eyes that asked a question I had no answer for. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with grief. "Why couldn't I save her?" "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my words barely audible over the sounds of her sobs. I knew it wasn't enough, but it was all I could offer. I had nothing else to give. As I stood there, helpless and grieving with her, I thought about my own mother, far away in the countryside, untouched by this plague. I thought about the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of my mother's voice calling me for supper, and I thought about how, in that moment, I would give anything to be somewhere else, anywhere else, to be with someone who didn't know this kind of pain, this kind of loss. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't turn away. She just stared, empty-eyed, as if the grief had consumed all the space inside her. I couldn't imagine what she was feeling. I couldn't find the words to console her, so I simply nodded to her and walked out. As I passed the other patients, I felt the weight of the promise I had made to that mother, the one I had failed to keep. I had promised her that I would do everything I could to save her daughter, and now I was left with only silence and the weight of that broken promise. The day went on, as days always do in this place. Another patient, another dose of morphine, another glass of water. The work never stopped, but in the quiet moments, when I am alone, I hear her mother's whispered words in my mind. Why couldn't I save her? And every time I don't have an answer. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening to our stories. If it moved you, consider subscribing for more voices from history. Stories told not through textbooks, but through the eyes of those who lived them. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.